Good evening. We're going to talk about the search for the perfect language and constructed languages today. Some, including Abraham Abulafia, have considered Hebrew to be the perfect language. Those of us who writing it and translate to it are often keenly aware of its shortcomings. Is a perfect language possible? Can one be developed inorganically, or must it evolve with culture? Can any language, even the most perfect, remain perfect in the face of changes in cultures? In this discussion, we'll talk about constructed languages, natural languages, and the quest for a perfect language. I'm going to start by asking our two esteemed panelists, who I will introduce now. First, Noah Mannheim, senior editor at Kineret Zmora Bitan. And second, our guest of honor, author Ch'iang. And I'll ask them to talk a bit about their connection to the perfect language or constructed languages. And Noah, you can start.
Well, first of all, I have to say that when I was thinking about what would be the hardest thing to do, it would be to talk in a panel about the perfect language in a language that is not your mother tongue. So I'm begging for your forgiveness if I fumble my words and forget what I wanted to say in midst talking. I'm actually here because of a constructed language. Not here in the panel, here in this life, here in this world. And the reason is because of Dr. Zamenhof, which was the inventor of Esperanto, which is till this day the most successful constructed language, as far as I know. Just to give you a comparison, there are, I think, about 5,000 websites in Esperanto compared to something like 7,000 in Hebrew. So it's...
There's more than 7,000 websites in Hebrew. There has to be.
Okay. That's the information I got from very unreliable sources, apparently. But never mind. I was in my stride.
You can count them, Didi, and get back to us.
Yes.
I have dyscalculia, so I'm taking the fifth.
Anyway, it was a language. It was constructed. It was done by Zamenhof. And what he wanted to achieve with this constructed language was greater understanding and greater harmony between human beings, because he summarized that the problem with the world is the fact that people can't communicate with each other. And since he was a Jew, his invention was very popular with European Jews around the early 20th century. And a lot of Jews around Europe studied Esperanto. And one of these Jews was my grandmother. And she studied it in Poland, along with learning Hebrew for some unfathomable reason. And when she came out of the concentration camp at the end of World War II, the end of the Holocaust, she had to cross all the way from where she was released in Europe to Germany, where my grandfather was waiting for her, although he didn't know it at the time. But she was a Polish Jew that was released in a camp that was far away from where she was, amongst people who didn't speak her language, and she had to try and communicate in order to get back to where she came from. And the people who liberated the camp where she was in were Italian soldiers. And she spoke Esperanto to them, and they understood her because a lot of the words are similar to the words in Italian. And they escorted her through the whole of Europe into Italy, where she found my grandfather. And they were married a week later, and this is why I'm here. So I think I have a very great appreciation of constructed languages. If it wasn't for Esperanto, I wouldn't be here today.
Ted, constructed languages, perfect languages.
Well, okay, so I actually suggested the this panel topic when Didi was asking me for possible panels, and
scared the hell out of me with that topic.
Well, so I should say the title of the panel is actually the title of a book by Umberto Eco, where he talks about the history of the idea of a perfect language, and in that book he mentions, I guess, because the idea of a perfect language has taken many forms throughout history. What is the language spoken by angels? What was the language spoken in the Garden of Eden? And there have been many candidates. I think it has been suggested that Armenian was the language spoken in the Garden of Eden.
Suggested by Armenians, perhaps?
Was the person who suggested its last name, and did it end with Jan? Is really what we're asking.
I think there's something very interesting to me about this idea of a perfect language, which is, and Umberto Eco points out, which is actually different than a universal language. Because the idea of a universal language is one that, would facilitate international communication, and Esperanto was an attempt at that. But a universal language is not the same thing as a perfect language. The original conception of a perfect language was a language where your utterances perfectly reflected what you intended to say. There was a direct relationship between what you said and the meaning. That the language would have a sort of a direct correspondence to reality, and that, I think, is a really interesting idea. Modern linguistics pretty much, is founded on the idea, almost the definition of a language, according to modern linguistics, is that it is arbitrary, and that there is no intrinsic relationship between what you say in any language and what the underlying meaning. So in that sense, modern linguistics' fundamental premise is that there cannot be a perfect language. But I think the idea of a perfect language remains very, very compelling. At least, it is something that I have sort of returned to indirectly in different stories of mine. In my story, Understand, the protagonist, he spends some time trying to design a perfect language in which to think. In my story, Story of Your Life, there is an alien language which the protagonist learns, which changes her way of thinking and gives her greater insight into sort of the nature of reality. And also, in my story, 72 Letters, there is that story is founded on the notion of that there are perfect names, that it is possible to uncover the ideal names of entities and use them in a sort of applied fashion. This notion of a perfect language is one that I continue to find interesting, even though I know that it is impossible by the premises of modern linguistics.
We're going to take questions later. What are some of the features you think a perfect language would have? Let's start with you, Ted.
Well, okay, so as I was just saying, I guess sort of the defining feature of this theoretical perfect language is that there would be some intrinsic relationship between the word for an idea and the idea itself, or the word for a thing and the thing itself. And again, historically, people have there were times when people thought Egyptian hieroglyphics were a form of a perfect language, because they thought that somehow these pictures did not represent sounds; they conveyed meaning directly. Also, at various points, Europeans thought Asian languages like Chinese might have these properties, because again they thought these symbols don't represent sounds, that they are somehow conveying meaning directly. Of course,
they were more symbolic languages in a way.
Yes. Of course, it turned out they were completely incorrect about all of those. Hieroglyphics do represent sound. Chinese language, the Chinese written language does, is a representation of sound. But that I guess the idea that that there might be a way to convey meaning without reference to any specific sound was in some ways also ties into the notion of a universal language. It's a way of conveying meaning that it would be independent of any nationality, any culture. But of course, if that were the case, then really, shouldn't people automatically be able to read hieroglyphics or Chinese? They wouldn't, you just look at it and understood what it said, and obviously that was not the case.
And obviously that also only works for written languages. That's that whole concept. It completely takes away any kind of phonetic transparency. It's completely phonetically opaque. There is no way to tell how a word sounds from reading it.
I guess the conception was that somehow people they didn't need to know how it sounded; that they could just look at it and understand what it meant. If only if there was some way to they could decode it, they would glean the meaning of it without needing a auditory layer.
No.
It sounds to me like you're talking a lot about the precision. I mean, that if a perfect language is to be discovered or constructed, it would be very precise, that it would be an ideal description of whatever it is that it was describing. It reminded me of John Locke's idea of constructing a language in the, I think it was the 18th century, in which every word would describe only a specific object. I mean, there would be this glass, and it would have one word, and there would be your glass, and it would have a totally different word describing it, which sounds to me like a very, very big dictionary, eventually. But I was thinking more about the aspect that you mentioned about the understanding, and I think for me a perfect language would be a language that would be understood completely and immediately. I mean, if you believe, which I don't, but if you do believe that the word was the world, the word and the world were created by some kind of supreme being, and that he used language in order to construct this universe, then the perfect language would be the language of creation and thus be understood by all who heard it, because it would have to be something that would be somehow embedded into us, and thus whoever heard it would instinctively and automatically understand it. Because I was thinking about the topic of constructed languages that you mentioned, Didi, and I was thinking a lot about what would be the point. I mean, what would be the driving motivation behind inventing that kind of language, knowing what we know about the way that languages can affect their speakers or their readers. And you can use it for good and you can use it for evil. You can do the 1984 version of Newspeech and eradicate certain words from your language and thus eradicate them from the existence of the psychology of the speakers. And you can use them in order to create maybe a better, more coherent existence for all
or
speakers.
Can you? You know, that's a big question.
I think the quest here is the point and not the discovery. I mean, I think that finding the perfect anything is a mission. It's a lifelong mission for anyone, but not one that you really want to accomplish.
I'll skip ahead to, because of stuff you guys both said, to a question I had for later, which is a perfect language something we can only imagine coming from either God or from the supernatural or from an alien source, which is something that you've dealt with a little bit in your stories, a particular story of your life. So do you think any being could, putting aside an omnipotent being can do anything, but could an external force create a perfect language? Either one, really.
I mean,
I'm silently praying. I don't know.
I mean, this is sort of a very an incredibly theoretical question, because as we have been discussing, from what we now know, the idea of a perfect language, it is impossible
for us.
Well, I guess I'm not sure how useful it is to, what kind of productive discussion we can have about things which are beyond our comprehension. Can we usefully talk about, like, can God make a rock so heavy that even he cannot lift it?
I was thinking about the same thing. In a language that only he can understand.
Or that we all could.
It's too perfect and we are too stupid.
But I think maybe, I was thinking maybe about computers. I mean, if there is a possibility to create, thinking in Kurzweilian terminology, after the big singularity hits us and we all become this computer hybrid individuals, all linked together by this common global computer link, there would have to be one language that we can all communicate with, mind to mind, whatever is left of us, brains in a tube or whatever.
It's called TCP/IP. It's what allows computers to talk to each other.
Yeah, but there might be a technological solution to this. And I was thinking, if there is one language that we all speak and that we all understand, doesn't it de facto make it perfect, even if it's not? I mean, it achieves the goal of the perfect language.
Well, no, I guess it achieves the goal of a universal language, but that's a far cry from a perfect language, because historically, in situations where a lot of people have like slaves in communities where they had no common language. They invent pigeons to speak with each other, and that is a type of constructed language that everyone understands, but it is a far, far cry from a perfect language. It is it's a very primitive and rudimentary form of communication, and actually one of the interesting things is that over time, children in such communities, they develop what are called creoles, which are sort of the actual language versions of the pidgins that their parents spoke.
Is it like Ebonics?
Not exactly like Ebonics, but I think
Which is, maybe it's more of a dialect. I don't know.
Well, I believe from a linguistics standpoint, pidgins are characterized by having almost no grammar, very, very simple grammar.
Wow, that sounds like a perfect language to me.
Except that without a grammar, you're very limited in what you can express, children who grow up in these communities, they sort of spontaneously invent a grammar using the vocabulary that their parents spoke.
So they're starved for grammar, and they create it even if it doesn't exist because they need the construct.
Yes, okay. And this is one of the reasons that, this is sort of evidence that supports the argument that we have a sort of, our brains are equipped with a language organ that some linguistic capability is built into us because in the absence of a grammatical language, human children will invent one.
Yeah, I see it at my house every day, almost. Has nothing to do with the actual grammar, though.
It's his own grammar.
Yes.
I wanted to go back to Esperanto, which you mentioned. Certainly the most large-scale attempt at creating a language, and the most successful, but ultimately is considered a failure. Why do you think it failed, and did it fail?
I know. Maybe it's because of what we've been talking about, the difference between a universal language and a perfect language. And maybe universal languages are much more imperfect than languages that developed organically and therefore can never be completely assimilated. Although Esperanto has some native speakers who were born and raised on Esperanto and speak it. There's some literature written in Esperanto. I know
Yes,
there's Zamenhof.
Born to some really odd families.
Yes. But I think it might be more imperfect than others, and thus more prone to failure.
And do you think it's more imperfect because it's constructed and didn't evolve?
I think it. Yeah, I think it's
To a lesser degree, largely because of a smaller user base and because it was so largely constructed in the original.
I think one of the things that he did that assisted Esperanto in the success that it had, that was limited but still much greater than others, that he used existing words and existing construction of languages that were there available for him, and not went and did the whole clean slate thing where you just wipe everything and you start to invent words, which I think is a task that is much too great for one person in one lifetime to achieve. So he was, a lot of it sounds familiar even if you have never heard it before. It's like if you hear someone speaking in Italian, if you know English and you heard a little Spanish, you could be pretty sure that you identify some of the words. I mean, it sounds familiar. It doesn't sound contrived. But still, I think, first of all, the success of a universal language is to have the universe, or people of the world, interested in participating in a universal discussion. I do not think we are at that stage yet, or shall ever be. So this is part of the problem. But it's hard to compress the very long evolution of languages into the lifespan of one individual who started working on this language pretty late in his life, and think it's going to catch on. And also there is English, which we speak here in this panel.
Well, okay. It's worth noting that Esperanto is, of course, a highly Eurocentric constructed language.
Mm-hmm.
It only sounds familiar if you are a native speaker of, a European language.
Any Latin-based language.
Yeah. I met a cognitive scientist in Japan who he complained that he sort of wished that there was a universal language in which all scientists in the world published their work, because that would sort of level the playing field. He felt that because English is sort of the de facto language in which most scientific research is published. It's most scientists, no matter what country they work in, they need some knowledge of English. But the problem with having English as a de facto universal language is that for a lot of scientists, English is an extraordinarily foreign language. He is a native Japanese speaker, and English. He talked about sort of there is a significant cognitive burden in trying to master another language and conduct serious work in that language. And so, he felt that, researchers, scientists in much of the world, they were at a disadvantage because English is so different from their native language. And so, ideally, for a truly level playing field, a constructed language would have to be equally unfamiliar to everybody. But who wants that?
Level playing fields are so awful.
Yes. Level playing field, level cities, leveling generally not always the best.
So that I think is just an illustration of the many sort of contradictory criteria that people are looking for in a universal language, let alone a perfect language. Even for a universal language, the things that you said, it sounds familiar. That's a great asset for some people. That makes Esperanto a great choice for some people, but it makes Esperanto a terrible choice for other people because it is completely unfamiliar.
No, but you mentioned Japan. I happened to do my little research and I discovered there is a branch of Shinto in Japan who embraced Esperanto. They speak it. They think that Zamenhof is a god. That is disturbing to the extreme. They've also invented Aikido. So don't mess with them. And it must have been very, very foreign for them as well. But that was just my side comment. Are you going to, at any point, claim that math is the perfect language? Because I want some warning in advance, because it's going to make me cry.
That's a topic for later. I have a question mentioning that, although not claiming that.
It's a universal language, though. It cannot be a perfect language.
Sadly, you are correct.
Yes.
I'm at odds with the universe.
Now, we were talking about how a perfect language is impossible, but there is an ongoing attempt to perfect languages in many ways. Society is always changing. We see some languages try and find better ways to deal with, for instance, non-binary gender people. Can any language hope to truly keep up with society, with the changes, and is this something that could come naturally, or we've seen Scandinavian countries adopt a third gender, and is that progress that you see is happening fast enough? Again, really anyone.
I think by the time that the Neanderthals were able to come up with a word for Homo sapiens, they were dead. So I think that the evolution of language will always be slower than the cultural and social changes that we experience, especially nowadays where it seems that they're only occurring in a much faster rate than they used to, although it's probably something that someone would say any panel anywhere in the world throughout history, from the birth of panels until now. I don't know.
Well, okay, so the question of language evolution, that does. I mean, the reality of language evolution poses a lot of problems for constructed languages, or certainly for attempts to create sort of a very rigid or strict grammatical structure for a constructed language, because language evolves and people are constantly using words in novel use, coming up with novel usages for words. So people use nouns as verbs, or verbs as adjectives, and many constructed languages where they in an attempt to create a very clear grammatical structure, they gave all verbs a certain ending, and all nouns a certain different ending, and all adjectives another different ending. They thought, oh well, this makes things so clear. But of course, as soon as young people start using verbs as nouns, then you've totally thrown that out the window. And I think there is
the problem with any perfectly constructed system is people.
No, the problem with every constructed system is change, and perfection cannot abide change. I mean, I was thinking about it while Didi was speaking, not while you were speaking. I listened while you speak. How could you create in a language that is perfect? I mean, how could you write in a perfect language? I mean, isn't I don't know, for instance, literature, which is something I know a little bit about, a lot of the time involves breaking these rules and playing with these rules and shifting the rules around and working against the expectations of the reader while using the language in a way that wasn't supposed to. And if the language was perfect, you wouldn't be able to do that.
Well, yeah, that's a very good point. Because I guess to some extent, this project of a perfect language, as opposed to a universal language, the project of a perfect language would sort of make all literary effort redundant, because
I say no to perfect languages.
Fortunately, we've established that they're impossible.
Because yes, I think you're right that there is a real sense in which the literary endeavor is an attempt to work around the limitations of language, and this this theoretical notion of a perfect language, yeah, I don't know what literary endeavor would look like. If could you say that that this sentence was exceptionally beautiful because in a perfect language, wouldn't wouldn't all sentences be perfectly beautiful, or would there be any other way to express something, except the one way? Yeah. So
variance is kind of critical for the use of language for art, certainly.
And also layers. I mean,
yes.
You wouldn't have layers. You would have this one strata of meaning, because everything would mean exactly what it is. So it would never be anything but what it actually is. It sounds very...
Could you even lie in perfect language?
What?
Could you even lie in a perfect language?
Oh, I could lie it anyway.
Questions are for later.
But yes, I mean, again, that's a good point, because I think one of the goals of people who've attempted to construct perfect languages was to remove ambiguity or avoid ambiguity, but and yes, so but that is impossible, and also that happens that ambiguity is. Ambiguity in language is what enables a lot of things that we like about language. Wordplay or puns, require
metaphors.
Yeah. Without ambiguity in language, a lot of what we consider creative in language would become impossible.
Yeah, and the only humor left would be physical gags, and then that would be terrible.
You know the joke about the guy who comes to the stand-up night and walks onto the stage and say, joke number 6, and everyone laughs. Very concise, very...
But then there's also that joke where another comedian, he goes on and he says, joke number 6, and no one laughs. And you didn't tell it right.
A thing that fascinated me when I was researching our panel topic about constructed languages is the hobbyists. Probably the second most popular constructed language in the world today is Klingon. There's the Klingon Language Institute, and there are...
And while I think the population of Klingon speakers is vastly smaller than Esperanto speakers, I think it is growing at a much greater rate than the population of Esperanto speakers.
One born every minute.
So Esperanto, watch out. Klingon is coming for you.
Probably more popular at Icon if we did a survey.
If you asked how many people on Icon speak Aramaic, no, you didn't. So don't take anything for granted. Aramaic is making a very huge comeback.
And
we'll talk about it tomorrow in a panel at 2:00 if you want. Aramaic is like the Hebrew version of Latin. If you want to make an occult-sounding anything, you use Aramaic.
Yeah. And one of the things that fascinates me about the people the guy who created Dothraki, and the people currently developing Klingon, there is now entire sections of the internet where hobbyists are talking about constructing languages. And I wonder, because these are hobbyists and these are people putting so much of their time as a community in it, do they maybe have a better chance at constructing a language that's useful?
It depends what you want to use it for. I mean, if you want to aggressively woo someone, yes, it would be very useful. Dothraki, Klingon, go for it.
Those are two popular examples from recent history.
Well, again, yeah. What are you trying to achieve? Because there are many constructed languages.
Yeah.
How many have how many have you ever heard of? the ones that
most of them that I've heard of in the past few weeks researching for this panel.
Yeah, but you know the constructed languages that that we know of like Klingon and now Dothraki. We are aware of them because they had multi-million-dollar media properties associated with them. Klingon basically had, a Hollywood budget behind it, which, no other constructed language had until potentially Dothraki now. So, there might be some fabulous constructed language in some corner of the internet, but how many of us will ever hear of it until it is used in a popular movie or TV show?
Maybe it could go viral.
But it's like
as or memeo.
But I think it's more like these languages that you invent with your friends, that you want to talk to them and don't want the parents to understand, and you still don't know English well enough, and your parents know English, so you can't really use it.
Yeah, but the people in those forums are actively concerned with constructing better languages, to constructing better communication tools. That's part of what I find so fascinating about conlang, as they call it. I kind of think that it's impossible for it to go viral simply because, no one else would understand it.
Language is a virus, as William Morris said.
And English has infected most of us.
Yes, I mean, any constructed language, it is almost completely intransmissible in viral terms. They are they're the hardest viruses to the hardest things to go viral ever.
I wanted to talk about quote unquote bad words. You were talking about newspeak and about using language to affect thinking, and certainly language does. But is it effective to try and make languages better by eliminating words, or is it a futile attempt? Can we, if words like the N-word, the C-word, when we say the N-word, we know what the N-word is. When we say the C-word, there's a couple of options, but there's one most prominent. We say the F words again. Are we making any progress by saying you can't say that word?
I don't think so. I mean, my example comes from, what you might consider good words, or if you're an atheist, then not. But if you think about the Shema Meforash, like the name of God in the Hebrew text, which is, don't stone me, Yehovah. Yeah, bring your stones next time. And your beards. Not enough beards in the audience. Where are all the hipsters? So you can't say Yehovah, which is I just did. So you say Adonai, which is like the substitute for it. And then you say Hashem, but you can't say Hashem. Then you say...
which means literally the name.
And then you say Hey, which is the first letter of Hashem. And then you can't say Hey, so you say Dalet, which I don't know where it came from. And then you just go through all the letters of the alphabet except for Zayin, which is the F word. So there's like infinite... You can just substitute each of those letters and each of these names for another one, and then it instantaneously becomes contaminated with divinity just by being the vessel for this meaning. So I really don't think it matters. I mean, if you see, I don't know, a show like Farscape or Firefly, where they use shiny all the time, I mean, it's not something that...
Or you know, more relevant, frel and frack.
I didn't want to be the one to say frack in this respectable panel, but you said it. We know what frack means.
Some people apparently want to get oil out of the ground.
Yeah. So you know what it means, even though it's not a word that we know of. It sounds like it's supposed to sound, and they use it when you're supposed to use it.
And it exists to bypass censors.
Yeah. So I don't think it's... I think it's two different questions. The first question is, will it help? Will it work? I don't think it works. The second question is, should we try? I'm not sure we should. I don't believe in laundering anything except for money. So.
Ted?
Well, okay, so this is sort of... this is, I guess, kind of a question, I think, related to, I guess, what is sometimes called political correctness. Because, as people have noted, there is this phenomena that's sometimes called, I think, the euphemism treadmill, where a word becomes considered impolite and is replaced with another term, and then that term is considered impolite and is replaced with another term, and so in a sense, you're constantly updating language and never really getting anywhere. So I think we're all familiar with the euphemism treadmill, and we know that it's a reality. There's no avoiding it. But as you point out, then there's a separate question: should we do it? And the fact that it is ultimately that this euphemism treadmill exists, the fact that we ultimately keep making terms, new terms, unacceptable. Should that stop us from trying to replace these terms? I don't know if the fact that that the attempt is sort of doomed to fail means that we should not try, because ultimately I think the motivation is the motivation for replacing an offensive word with a less offensive word. I think that is that's a legitimate motivation. I think that's an honorable motivation. I think that I think that there is good reason to try and reduce offense.
I agree. I don't think we shouldn't try it because it's doomed to failure. Most of the things we do are doomed to failure, and we still try to do it. But I was thinking, I mean, this is, for me, I think one of the proofs that the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that claims that language changes your perception of reality, putting it very basically, I think.
Yes.
Does it really? I mean, if we know what the F word means and we can be offended by it, even though the word itself, which represents that offensive name, does not exist there anymore. There's just the remnants of it, and the remnants of it is present enough to be insulting. Did it help? Did it work? And by eliminating these words from our language, I think we are missing something. We are losing something. We are forbidding, I don't believe in forbidding words. I think forbidden words is something that is dangerous.
I think that, okay, I also don't believe in forbidding words, but there's the point of usage, which is there are words that are tainted to a degree that they are beyond the pale. There are words that exist solely to represent a feeling of hate. A word like, I'm going to use some not nice words now, a word like tranny, a word like nigger, a word like chink. These words have, a word like kike. These words don't have any usage rather than hate, or talking about hate, which is what I'm doing.
But isn't talking about hate one of the most important things that we can do?
Yes, but the people who use it...
But how can you talk about hate if you can't even use the words that encapsulate the hate? I mean, I want them to be out there so I can see them. I want my enemies where I can see them. I don't want them sneaking around my back and, knifing me with sweet words that are polite and politically correct and dressed up, so I wouldn't be able to identify them when they come.
Yes,
and they still bear that same charge of hatred.
But making those words unacceptable is exactly what leaves them to the use of people who believe what, whose hatred is we consider unacceptable.
I don't agree with you at all. I think maybe making them unacceptable is giving land rights and use rights just to the people who would use them in their original meaning.
Yes, but it gives them a flag. They have a flag that says, we are racist assholes. I have shown this flag by using this word.
I don't know, I think like the white robe and the big white cape and the burning cross are usually identifiable enough.
Those aren't as common anymore. Ted, we've been talking for a while.
I'm not sure I have a lot to contribute to this particular topic. I mean, I think, it is a difficult question because, what I was referring to earlier about the desire to not offend. I think that is a perfectly good motive, but yes, policing language. It can take many different forms and can be used by different people to further the different goals, and so it is always possible to. It's pretty much always possible to take something that was to take a strategy that was sort of well-intentioned and then bend it toward ill-intentioned ends, it's always possible to use arguments, use an argument which was perfectly valid when made by someone else, but to use that argument in a disingenuous fashion to further your own ends. And the fact that it's a good argument when made by someone else, that provides cover for you to use it disingenuously.
And that is certainly a thing we see online every day if we go for a field online or if we're on Twitter or Tumblr.
But you made me think about languages as weapons. And we talked about 1984, and I was thinking about Snow Crash and Babel 17, where, it's some kind of a perfect language, the Delaney book, where everyone who hears it automatically is transformed by it and transformed in a way that is, it's understood in most of the book to be evil. And it's the perfect language.
Actually, this reminds me of Monty Python's funniest joke, the joke that kills you.
It would.
That's the joke that's so funny. Anyone that is, you know, it comes in contact with it dies. And now for the math question. I know, you were told there will be no math.
Can I be excused? Could I be excused?
Science fiction has posited many times that math would be the tool for conversing with other species or for creating universal languages. While math is probably, as far as we know, universal, do you think that's too simplistic?
You use math and simplistic in the same language. And said two. I don't understand you. Have words later.
I didn't say simple. I said simplistic. Okay.
Okay. All right. So I once had a long argument with a cognitive scientist about whether math was universal, and I was arguing that math is universal, and he was arguing that there are human cultures that have no word for numbers greater than 3. So, and those cultures exist perfectly well. So he actually made the argument that that mathematics is cultural in pretty much the same way that tennis is cultural. It was a game it's a game with rules, and yeah, I took strong exception to this, and yeah, we argued for quite a while, and I can't say we got anywhere with that.
If you would have argued in math, then your understanding would have been so precise that you would have reached a conclusion.
Unless you were arguing with either me and Noah, who are both suffer from dyscalculia, and we wouldn't understand anything. Which also goes a bit to belie the premise that it is universal.
Well, okay, so I suppose in science fiction, in the context of science fiction, the basis for this idea that math is a good way of communicating with aliens, is has certain assumptions that you're dealing with a highly technological civilization. You are you may be trying to communicate over interstellar distances with radio waves. So there's a huge number of assumptions that go into that. So if you grant all those, if you grant the situation like, okay, we are trying to communicate with an alien civilization over interstellar distances with radio waves, what is our best hope? I mean, yeah, I'm gonna say our best shot is with math. Does that mean that I mean, okay, does that mean math is universal? If we say that math being universal means that every culture does use it, then obviously no. Not every culture makes use of math. Not every person makes use of math. But I guess I would claim that any culture that that becomes highly technological, I think that they will all have to arrive at sort of a lot of the same general ideas in order to achieve technological sophistication. I think that everyone will need to arrive at roughly the same value of pi, if they're going to, be, say, building, internal combustion engines. I think I find it hard to imagine that, another society could, become highly technological and come up with a different value of pi than we came up with. I just can't picture that. So, again, we need to sort of specify the context.
What about algorithms?
I'm coming to audience questions real soon.
It's not a question, it's a comment.
Also audience comment. Let's call it audience participation.
Timing is everything.
No, I think you were lifting your microphone to the general direction of your mouth.
No. I have nothing. No, I have nothing to say except for the fact that I think that you yourself proved wonderfully in the story of your life that aliens might use math, but they might use it in a way that is completely, well, alien. To us, and would not, even come from the same basic assumptions as we do. I mean, if the Hopi people of the Amazon don't have the concept of time as we perceive it, and they develop their own math, it would look different than the one that we, or I, don't understand, but people do understand. Bear in mind, I really don't understand it, so I might be going right off the mark here, but if they don't perceive time the way that we do, their math might look different. It might not be different, but it would be delineated differently.
How do we communicate it?
Yes.
If it's supposed to be
we sent over there a disc, a huge golden disc, with no disc player or anything. I mean, what did we expect would happen? They would just walk over there and invent something to play the disc on, or have that technology
they put it in their universal disc reader.
Of course, the universal disc reader.
Literally universal.
Yes.
Well, okay. I mean, that's to be fair. The messages that have been placed on the various interstellar probes like Pioneer, those were not. I think their primary purpose was not an attempt to actually communicate with an alien species. Their primary purpose was sort of a symbolic one for people on Earth to think about, give them some perspective on, our place in the universe. If your primary goal is to try and communicate, they would probably have gone about it differently. But I think their primary goal, was one of, sort of trying to maybe symbolically unite the human community. And,
or in other words, PR. Which I'm not saying is unimportant. That was not a joke. I was dead serious. I think that the purpose is public relations is not a curse word. It is not one of those bad words that we were talking about. I think that when it is that the message is not the scientific message it was purported to be, but a message to mankind, it is absolutely a PR move, in my opinion. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe not shout at the moderator because you disagree, not entirely. And now we go to audience questions. And okay, quite a significant percentage of the audience.
A sigh of relief is heard throughout the audience.
Okay, you raise your hand first.
You said before, when you talked about the perfect language, it would be really hard to create literature with it. But if there is a specific word for everything, and it's really specific, can we invent anything, like new objects?
I mean, again, this is a very sort of abstract, theoretical question. I mean, I suppose in one sense it would be possible to come up with new objects, but it would be, but having invented a new object, you would have very little freedom about what to name it, because the system in this, theoretical perfect language would dictate what the name of this newly invented object would be. So you would not have a lot of freedom in what you named it. But that is so I guess that might allow for, say, creativity in terms of inventing things, but not creativity in the linguistic realm.
Also, I think there could be a number of solutions to that problem. I mean, from the fantastical, you can create something new only when something old has been destroyed and the name has been available. Or that you can have, think about when you name a child. So you use a name that's already been, someone else has used that name to give to his child, but it's never, or, from a statistical point of view, the odds that this child has this name, this last name, this mother's name, and this father's names are not very great. I was just reading Magnus Chase, the new book from the Rick Riordan series. And they have the dwarfs there make these objects, and they don't just name them. I mean, if you talk about a glass, you have to recite the whole history of the glass and who made it and by whom it was made and from what materials. And, sit on this chair, and then there's like a passage and a half reciting the history, the glorious history of the chair. So I think there can be, solutions to this problem, but they're going to be laborious and exhausting.
Before I go to the next question, I'll mention another possibility, which is combining of terms. Ted has on his wrist a watch. I have on my wrist a smartwatch. Now, that's obviously a marketing term, but when changing a concept that people were all very familiar with and iterating on it, technology companies came up with this very clear shorthand that was very obvious to most people in its meaning. Questions?
So, slang in it in the cover.
Right here. No, here.
You refer to the impossibility and the curse of a perfect language. But can you think about the problems with universal language on the same terms? For example, we know from the Bible that God supposedly made mankind dispersed by the inability to have a universal language. Would we lose much, and is it really a good idea to try to achieve universal language?
I guess I think I don't see any actual downside to a universal language. As we discussed, I think there are a lot of practical problems with trying to create a universal language. But the Tower of Babel story, I feel like I don't really sympathize with God in that story. When God creates a confusion of tongues, I I guess I question his motives there, because I think that I think humanity was in that story. They were working cooperatively, and they were getting really great results, and they were getting such good results that God had to throw a roadblock in their path, and I feel like I don't know what God's. I'm not sympathetic to God's motivations in that story, because I think if better communication would let us work more effectively, and I think I think that would be a good thing. I don't feel like there's any enterprise where better communication would cause us to do anything I would have been all in favor of them actually completing that tower.
I'm going to go to you in the back. As loud as you can, please.
So, most of the people think in the language they're speaking, like native language. And if it was a perfect language with a word to every term, how can even you think about new terms?
How can you think about new terms?
How can you even think about something that doesn't exist?
I don't think in a language.
Well, okay, so all right. Again, this is a very abstract theoretical discussion, but to try and tie it to some actual real-world linguistics, there's linguistic thinking and there is non-linguistic thinking. If you imagine the route you take to go home, and then you try and explain to someone the route you take to go home, you're engaging in sort of two different processes. So there's clearly a type of thinking which does not involve language. You can think about all sorts of things, in a completely non-linguistic manner. And so I think that, again, in this sort of abstract theoretical way, there would be, problems you could solve, or things you might invent, because I think a lot of those do take place on a non-linguistic level. So this, even given this notion of a perfect language, I don't think that would mean the end of thinking new thoughts. All it would mean is that, having come up with new thoughts, there would be only maybe one way to express them linguistically. But that doesn't mean that there is a limit to the new thoughts that you could have. That's how I see it.
I'm going to go to you in the back.
First of all, a small note. Wittgenstein wouldn't agree with what you just said, but there are thoughts that cannot be verbalized and things that are verbalized that cannot be thought. It is anathema to what he thinks. The question is...
Thought.
It is a bit surprising that no one mentioned here the concept of the second-order languages as a solution, like the language that is derived from math, which is formal logic, for example, not a language which stands on its own, but which serves to actually clarify an actual language. And it doesn't need to have its own verbs and nouns because it is dependent on another language. And this also somewhat solves the theoretical question of only an alien being able to create a perfect language, because it is not exactly theoretical, because it would be a second-order language instead of a first-order language.
Questions have question mark at the end of them. Next.
You opened the floor for audience comments as well. I would just like to clarify.
Okay, then let me clarify. Questions. You, sir.
First of all, as for Esperanto, I am an Esperantist, and I don't think it has quite failed. It exists and it's quite around.
My question did include, did it fail? But yes.
Yes, but the answer, okay. At the last Esperanto Congress 2 months ago in France, I learned about another language which tries to be something similar to a perfect language in its way. It's called Tokipona. It's a language with 120 words, which is supposed to be able to express everything. Have you heard about Tokipona?
Ran into it while researching this panel, but not otherwise.
It sounded very interesting. It's a very concise language and a very positive one. I think a lot of it tries to convey a positive outlook on the universe. Maybe that's why there's so few words.
You second from.
Have you explored the idea that maybe language is not there to express what there is, but perhaps protect us from what we can perceive? That perhaps it's kind of contradiction in term, because there are things we aren't able to perceive in using language to protect ourselves from them. Like maybe time perception, but everything happening at once.
That I had not considered that. I guess I feel like that is sort of a horror fiction view of the universe, and I mean I don't mean to be derogatory, but I guess I feel like you're positing the idea that there is some fundamental incompatibility between the human mind and profound truth or ultimate reality. That there are things about profound truth or ultimate reality that the human mind cannot deal with, and that we need protection from that.
It could be something psychological. It doesn't have to be something dramatic, like things we don't want to know.
Yeah.
We don't want to feel.
I don't think any of us see how language protects us from that.
Not necessarily. I think I can understand it, if it's okay for me to understand it.
I said I don't think.
Okay. It can provide a kind of barrier from, if it's a tool that we use to analyze our experiences or perceive the world or describe the world. It also functions as some kind of, lubrication between us and the experience. If you talk about it, this is why people would tell you that it helps to talk about it. I mean, sometimes expressing an experience and reliving it through the medium of words distances us a little bit from it, allows us to maybe somehow take it out from ourselves and put it, when you say put it into words, you take it from yourself, you put it into the words, and then the experience has gained maybe a small distance. There's a margin between us and whatever it is that we experience if we're talking about maybe a traumatic experience. I mean, psychology that you've mentioned is based on this whole notion of the words having the power to heal, and they would not be able to have the power to heal if they were really a part of us. I mean, they're standing a bit apart from us, thus being able to shield us and also be a conduit from us to the outside world. So I get what you're saying, I think.
There's a story. There's a story, Don't Tell Me On Your Mind, not more than a day or two, talks that language creates barriers.
Yes.
Removing is what you need to do to understand everything.
Our time is limited, so we're going to go to the next person. You're right there.
seems that we all agree that there's a strong coupling between language and culture. Okay, whether it affects your perception of the world or how you think, etc. So maybe the question is rigged. Like, I mean, how can you say there could be a perfect language if there isn't a perfect culture? Or maybe, you know, we first have to solve this question.
Of course the question is rigged. We're using language to pose it.
Well, I mean, I think you know, you're correct, but as we were saying, you know, this idea of a perfect language is sort of a very old one, which I think predates the sort of modern understanding of the way that language and culture are inextricably linked. And you know, as I was saying at the beginning, everything we know about linguistics says that, you know, the idea of a perfect language is completely impossible, because, you know, it's part of sort of, you know, the modern definition of a language is in contradiction to that, to, you know, there being a perfect language. But, you know, this is, I think this reflects, you know, a modern understanding of linguistics, which was not held by people who were in search of a perfect language. And, you know, it's sort of a very romantic notion, which you know, yeah, I admit is, you know, has no real basis in reality, but I still find it sort of very compelling as a romantic notion, which is why I wanted to talk about it at this panel.
Okay, we're going to our final two questions, so your question needs to be fairly brief. You're right here, the one who shouted at me.
I wanted to ask, one, how do you reflect on Walter Benjamin's thought about universal and or perfect language? I think it's an open question, but which one it is. And the other one is, have you explored or thought about Sanskrit, which they claim is the perfect language in the sense that you mentioned, that there is the exact meaning of the exact thing?
I'm afraid I'm not familiar with Walter Benjamin's work on this question, so I can't comment on that.
Ask of the translator? The task of the translator?
I have not read it. I'm sorry. Although the whole question of, you know, translation, that is a very interesting one, which, you know, we could probably, yeah, we could spend, you know, several panels, you know, devoted entirely to that question, and then I'm sure we would, you know, touch upon a lot of the questions that Walter Benjamin addresses in his essay. I guess I'm a little familiar with that, the notion, yeah, that some people claim that Sanskrit is a perfect language, and that the sounds of the Sanskrit letters are in some ways like the building blocks of the universe, or the sounds of creation. And I guess this is sort of a precept of certain branches of Hinduism. But again, I guess and like I said, I do find that a very compelling idea. From a sort of from a storytelling standpoint, as a science fiction writer, I like that idea. But everything I've read about actual modern linguistics, says that there's no scientific basis for that. That is purely a religious belief of a certain culture, and has no objective, universal truth.
It is roughly as chauvinistic as the Abulafia claim that Hebrew is the perfect language. People want to believe that their thing is the best thing, and I think that's the case here. One last short question. If your question is long, put your hand down. You here.
It's scary.
So if you look at the concept of a perfect language as a thing that expresses perfectly what I wanted to tell you, and dumps all this information into your head perfectly, then we can say it's almost like not a language anymore, but telepathy. So do you think that in that sense, language is sort of like a crutch that we use because we can't do it perfectly mind to mind?
Yes. Yes, language is what we do because we're not telepathic. Although, in telepathy, what language would we communicate and how would we communicate our thoughts and ideas, even if we had telepathy?
Well, and that's the, I've never read a discussion of telepathy that, got into any specifics, because, I think that, the idea of telepathy is it's pure wish fulfillment, and it doesn't really I don't know if it withstands any close analysis. I think it is it's not even something that you can describe in any detail, because it is so purely a fantasy that I've never read a description of telepathy that gave me any clear sense of what it might be like, other than just as sort of an idealized desire.
In Alfred Bester, The Demolished Man, they have the telepathy there is very visual. It's not, it doesn't involve a lot of, there are some words, but it's mostly visual images and not language.
Well, although in The Demolished Man, there's definitely a linguistic component to it, because
Freudian, even,
because the protagonist he uses a jingle as a mental defense, because.
But it's the music; it's not the words. There's the whole thing with it's like a half cadence or something.
I think it's both words and the music.
Now I have to read it again. Thank you.
Yes.
Can I just say one last thing?
One last thing.
One last thing?
Yeah.
Because I read this and it's really cool. Because you started with the Abulafia, and I want to end with the Rambam, which is another Jewish scholar that said that if you have a dream and someone is talking to you in the dream and you don't see who's talking to you and you don't know the language, but you understand what he's saying, then it's the voice of God. So, sweet dreams.
And with that, I would like to thank our two wonderful panelists, Noma and Ch'iang. And I would like to thank you for being an awesome audience. Thank you.